Thank you very much. One small point. A couple of people have asked me what if they wanted to follow up the sort of thing that I was talking about last night, and indeed the sort of thing I'm about to talk about now. The most elementary and short book which does that is a book called Is There a God? It's not a book on that table for some reason, but it is a very short, popular book, and probably more copies of it have been sold than of any other of my books. But of course there are more complicated versions of all these things over there. Right. I was arguing yesterday in favor of the existence of a God who is everlastingly omnipotent, from which I argued it follows that he would be perfectly free and perfectly good and omniscient. And just to remind you, God being omnipotent is his being able to do anything logically possible, that is, anything the description of which does not involve a self-contradiction. God being omniscient, as I'm understanding it, is his knowing everything that's logically possible to know. And if, as I was suggesting last night, it's not possible for anyone to know future free choices, then God's omniscience will not include such knowledge of our future free choices, if indeed we do have free will, as I'm going to assume. But of course, remember, it will only be by God's choice that humans do have any free choices, and so that with respect to us, there is that limit to his knowledge. Now, the evils of the world, the things intrinsically bad, suffering and wrongdoing, two sorts of things we must bear both in mind, suffering and wrongdoing, are clearly events which an omnipotent God could, if he so chose, prevent. Yet it seems evident to many people that if there is a God, in virtue of his perfect goodness, God would prevent these evils, and so that their occurrence is, people understandably feel, conclusive evidence against the existence of God. In this essay, I seek to rebut this objection by arguing that it is not a bad thing for someone to cause suffering or to do any otherwise wrong act, or to allow others to cause suffering or to allow them to do otherwise wrong acts, so long as certain conditions are satisfied. And I shall suggest that they are satisfied when the someone is God and the suffering and wrongdoing is the actual sufferings and wrongdoings of humans in this world. I stress of humans. There is also a problem of animal suffering, but for reasons of time, I'm not going to discuss that. What I'm going to conclude is that the evils of the world do not tend to show that there is no God. I'm not going to argue that no evils would show that. I'm simply arguing that the evils that we know about do not show that. To offer an account of the reasons a good God might have for allowing suffering is to present a theodicy, a justification of God in allowing these things to occur. And what I'm going to do in this lecture is present my theodicy. Now, I hope once again you all have a handout. It's a shorter one than for the previous lecture, but you'll need it. I suggest that it is not a bad thing for an agent P to allow a bad state of affairs, an evil E, to occur. It's not a bad thing for any agent P to allow an evil E to occur, so long as, firstly, allowing E or an evil equally bad to occur is the only way in which P can bring about some good state, G. P does all he can to bring about G. 3, P has the right to allow E to occur. And 4, G is a sufficiently good state such that the good of allowing it to occur probably outweighs the badness of E. Just take a simple, mundane example of that. Suppose P is the parent of a child suffering dental pain in an era before dentists could use anesthetics. It is not a bad act for P to take the child to the dentist and to allow him to suffer the pain of a dental filling. E, for the sake of the child's subsequent pain-free dental health. G, so long as these four conditions are satisfied. Firstly, so long as that's the only way in which P can bring about the good state, by taking the child to a dentist and allowing him to suffer. Secondly, P takes the child to a competent dentist, that's to say, he does all he can to bring about the good state. Thirdly, as a parent, P has the right to take the child to the dentist. This third clause is important. No complete stranger has the right to take a child to the dentist to have his tooth filled without the permission of the child's parents, even if that complete stranger thereby promotes a good state. And fourthly, the good of the subsequent dental health probably outweighs the evil of the suffering. Now, we humans could not always give a child good dental health without the child having to suffer, but God could. It is only the logically impossible that God is unable to do. So, extrapolating from the case of suffering to the case of evils generally, and from the case of humans to the case of God who can do anything logically possible, I suggest that God could allow an evil to occur compatibly with his perfect goodness, so long as the four conditions are satisfied. And in their application to God, they are on your handout. The first condition, when we're considering the P as God and the evils are the evils of this world, first, it must be logically impossible for God to bring about some good state of affairs, G, in any other morally permissible way than by allowing E, or some evil equally bad, to occur. For example, it is logically impossible for God to give us libertarian free will. What I mean by libertarian free will is a free will to choose, to some extent independent of all the causes that act on us. It is logically impossible for God to give us libertarian free will to choose between good and bad, and yet also to cause us to choose the good. He can't both give us the free will and cause us to choose the good. That is logically impossible. Secondly, God must do everything logically impossible to bring about logically possible to bring about the good state, G. Thus, if he take a slightly different example, if he brings about pain in order to give us the opportunity of freely choosing whether to or not to bear it courageously, he has also to have given us free will. It's no good God giving us certain goods, which would be a good thing if he gave us free will, and then not giving us free will. It must be that if he does give us the possibility of bringing about the evils, that doesn't stop it, then that must in fact serve a good cause. Thirdly, God must have the right to allow the evil to occur. That is, it must be morally permissible for him to allow the evil to occur. And finally, some sort of comparative condition must be satisfied. It cannot be as strong as the condition that G be a good greater than E is an evil. For obviously we are sometimes justified, in order to ensure the occurrence of a substantial good state, in risking the occurrence of a greater evil. A plausible formal way of capturing this fourth condition is to say that, some of you may know the technical terminology, is to say that the expected value of allowing E to occur, given that God does bring about G, must be positive. Loosely, it must be pretty probable that the good will occur, and that if it does, it will outweigh the evil. But there may well be cases where the improbable does occur and the evil outweighs the good. I shall summarize the claim with respect to some evil E, that if there is a God, he could, compatibly with his perfect goodness, allow it to occur in order to promote a good G, as the claim that E serves a greater good. He will serve a greater good if those four conditions are satisfied, and God will be justified in bringing about their evil if those four conditions are satisfied. So let me work through different ways in which these conditions are satisfied with respect to the evils of this world. And I begin by pointing out ways in which the first condition is satisfied for various kinds of evil. I begin with moral evil. Moral evil means evil which either deliberately or through negligence humans cause to each other. I stress or through negligence. Many of the evils of the world are not brought about by deliberately. They are brought about by governments not doing anything and people not urging governments to do anything, and then the evil occurs. That is also a case of moral evil because it's a case of negligence, which is a knowing negligence, that is. So, moral evil. I have already alluded to the traditional free will defense, which points out that an agent having a free choice between good and evil can logically only be brought about by allowing the agent to bring about evil. But it's a good thing not merely that agents shall have a choice between good and evil, but that the choice should make a difference to things. It's good that the free choices of humans should include genuine responsibility for other humans. That involves the opportunity either to benefit them or to harm them. I argued yesterday that it is a good thing that humans should have limited powers to form the world in the way that they choose and not just in the way that God has programmed them to choose. And thereby, of course, they share or can share in God's creative activity. But for their choice to make a real difference to things, they must have the power to choose contrary to what God intended. That's giving us real responsibility for things. A world in which agents could benefit each other but couldn't harm each other is one where they have only limited, very limited responsibility for each other. If my responsibility for you is limited to whether or not to give you a widescreen television set, but I cannot cause you pain, stunt your growth, or limit your education, then I don't have a great deal of responsibility for you. A God who gave agents only such limited responsibility for their fellows would not have given much. God would have reserved for himself the all-important choice of the kind of world it was to be, while simply allowing humans the minor choice of filling in the details. He would be like a father asking his older son to look after the younger son, and adding that he would be watching the elder son's every move and would intervene the moment the elder son did a thing wrong. The elder son might justly retort that while he would be happy to share his father's work, he could really only do so if he were left to make his own judgments as to what to do within a range of the options available to the father. A good God, like a good father, will delegate responsibility. But in order to allow creatures a significant share in creation, God has to allow them the choice of hurting and maiming others and thus frustrating the divine plan. So, by allowing such hurting and maiming, God makes possible the genuine good of humans freely choosing to benefit rather than harm each other, and thus the free choice of cooperating in God's plan. If we could make plenty of choices, but God intervened the moment those choices had no effect, then we wouldn't be responsible for each other. And it's a great, great good that we are responsible for each other. It's a great good, above all, for parents, that they are responsible for children. Plenty of very ordinary people have these enormous responsibilities, and they wouldn't have that if God had just organized them so that they could only make good choices. They wouldn't have this great gift of responsibility. But human good free choices are not merely good in themselves and in virtue of their immediate consequences. All human choices are character forming. Each good choice makes it easier for the agent to make his next choice a good one. Agents thereby can form their own character. Aristotle famously remarked, quote, "We become just by doing just acts, prudent by doing prudent acts, brave by doing brave acts," close quote. And I think what he meant is this: by doing a just act when it's difficult, when it goes against our natural inclinations, which I call our desires, by doing a just act when it goes against our natural inclinations, we make it easier to do a just act next time. And thereby we can gradually change our desires so that, for example, doing just acts becomes natural and we feel uncomfortable not doing just acts. Thereby we can free ourselves from the power of the bad desires to which we are subject. But again, the great good of us having the free choice of character formation, our own character formation, choosing the sort of people we are to be, can logically only be had if there is the danger that we will allow ourselves to corrupt our character and so become bad people. If we yield to the desire every time, well, we get the desire next time, but if we go on and on yielding to the desire becomes natural to us, the alternative just isn't there anymore. So that's the good that our ability to do moral evil makes possible. I turn now to natural evil. That is evil of a kind unpreventable by humans. Currently unpreventable by humans, such as the evil of suffering caused by a disease of a kind currently uncurable. What is known as the higher order goods defense points out that certain kinds of especially valuable free choice are possible only as responses to evil. I can logically only show courage in bearing my suffering if I am suffering an evil state. My suffering from disease when I have the strong temptation to say, my suffering from can I go on? Is that safe? I'll begin that paragraph again. We've been talking about moral evil, and I come on now to natural evil, that is, evil of a kind unpreventable by humans, such as the evil of suffering caused by disease of a kind currently incurable. What is known as the higher order goods defense points out that certain kinds of especially valuable free choice are possible only as responses to evils. I can logically only show courage in bearing my suffering if I am suffering an evil state. My suffering from disease when I have strong temptation to self-pity gives me the opportunity to show courage. It is good that we shall have the opportunity occasionally to do such actions which involve resisting great temptations, because thereby we manifest our total commitment to the good. A commitment which we do not make when the temptation to do otherwise is not strong is not a total commitment. It is good, too, that among the good actions which we should have the occasional opportunity to do is to help others who are suffering and deprived by showing sympathy to them and helping them to cope. Help is most significant when it is most needed, and it is most needed when its recipient is suffering and deprived. But I can logically only help others who are suffering if there is the evil of their suffering. In these cases, if there is a God, he makes possible the good of free choices of particular kinds, good and evil, which logically he could not give us without allowing the evils, or evils equally bad, to occur. If God is to give us a real free choice between helping and not helping others, he must make a world where the others really do suffer. And merely allowing the suffering caused by moral evil would not give very much opportunity for such choices. For this, we need disease, accident, and the weakness of old age. You could have free choices, but not free choices of these kinds without there being natural evils. And it's these choices, when you're suffering or they're suffering in a big way, that gives you the deepest opportunity and the most important opportunity for manifesting virtue in a big way. It is good, too, that among the choices available to humans should be the choice not merely of helping others to cope with natural evils such as disease, but of whether to reduce the number of such natural evils in future, for example, preventing disease. But to have this choice, we need to know what causes these evils. The natural way in which we, or rather the scientists among us supported by our money, the normal way in which we try to discover such things is the inductive way. We seek to discover the natural processes, bacteria, viruses, and so on, which bring about diseases, and then construct and test theories of the mechanisms involved. But scientists can only do that if there are regular processes producing the diseases, and then they can only learn what these processes are by studying many populations and studying under which circumstances some disease is transmitted and under which it is not. So, for the great good of investigating, or alternatively not bothering to investigate, there is required the necessary evil of the actual disease. If humans are to have the great opportunity of devoting their lives to scientific research for human benefit, or not bothering to do so, there have to be sufferers from disease to make this possible. Many of the early Christian fathers saw the rationality of which the ability to pursue such scientific inquiry is a paradigmatic example, saw rationality together with free will as the two things which humans have, which constituted their being made in the image of God. All the same, an objector may say, wouldn't it be better if God planted in us strong, true beliefs about the causes of all diseases and other natural evils, and then just left us with the choice of whether or not to cure the diseases? Is the opportunity to exercise rationality in this way, to pursue scientific investigation and find out what are the causes and so on, is the opportunity to pursue rational inquiry in this way worth the price? But if God abolished the need for rational inquiry and gave us perhaps at birth strong, true beliefs about the causes of things, that would greatly reduce the difficulty of making serious moral decisions, and so make it much less easy for us to show total commitment to the good and thereby form heroic characters. As things are in the actual world, most moral decisions are decisions taken under uncertainty about the consequences of our actions. I do not know for certain that if I smoke, I will get cancer. And I do not know for certain that if I give money to some charity, if I do not give money to some charity, people will starve. So we have to make our moral decisions on the basis of how probable it is that our actions will have various outcomes, How probable is it that I will get cancer if I continue to smoke, or that someone will starve if I do not give money? These decisions under uncertainty are not merely the normal moral decisions, they are also the hard ones. Since probabilities are so hard to assess, it's all too easy to persuade yourself that it's worth taking the chance that no harm will result from the less demanding decision. That is, the decision which you have a strong desire to make. And even if you do face up to a correct assessment of the probabilities, true dedication to the good is shown by doing the act which, although it's probably the best action, may have no good consequences at all. The uncertainty situation which we're in and which we pursue scientific research to resolve is the difficult one. And if we are to form heroic characters, not merely moderately good characters, but heroic characters, we need a few of those situations. So, both in order to give us the opportunity to deal with all important matters by exercising our rationality, and in order to give us the opportunity to manifest our commitment to the good most strongly, and thereby make ourselves very good people by making choices in a situation of uncertainty, it is good that God should not cause us to be born with strong true beliefs about the consequences of our actions, and so to give us the opportunity to choose whether or not to seek out more certain knowledge of the consequences of those actions. Getting this knowledge will involve getting more data about the consequences of events. For example, data from the past about what happened to people who have smoked in ignorance of the possibility that smoking causes cancer. Is there some door that might be shut so that all of this doesn't come through? Seeking more certain knowledge, in other words, involves once again relying on normal induction, and this requires the existence of natural evils. So what I've been talking about so far is I have been pointing out that moral evil, people actually hurting other people or allowing other people to suffer through negligence, and natural evil, disease and accident not of a currently preventable kind, that these evils provide us with opportunities which we wouldn't otherwise have of making a difference to the world, in a big difference sometimes to particular individuals. We're responsible for them, and making a difference to ourselves by gradually forming our own character. And these are very great goods, that we should form our own character and that we should make a great difference to others. But they can't be had unless there are significant choices to be had. That means significant choices between good and evil, choices that really do affect things. So I come on now to the second criterion, criterion 2. Because this is a short lecture, I shall assume that in those cases where free will, and especially free will of certain kinds, is the great good for which God allowing the evil to occur is a necessary condition, I shall assume that we do have the necessary free will by which we choose which action to do. If we are merely deterministic systems, this defense isn't going to work. So I am assuming that we do have limited free will. It does seem to us that way. It seems to us within limits we can make choices and it's up to us. But of course there have been objections from science against this, and elsewhere I have written what I think about these objections, that they don't work, but for the purposes of this lecture I'm just going to assume they don't work. Given that we do have libertarian free will, that is free will to make certain choices independent of causes acting upon us, that free will is certainly responsible free will. That is to say, our choices do make great difference to ourselves and each other. and thereby we do have serious responsibility for ourselves and each other. So, suppose there are goods and evils. There's still an echo somewhere, if that could be dealt with. So, suppose that there are goods and evils for which conditions 1 and 2 are justified. What about condition 3? Does God have the right to cause or allow evil to occur for humans for the sake of some greater good? The trouble may seem more acute in that in many cases, including some of those I've been discussing, good for one human is promoted by evil endured by a different human. Does God have the right to make you suffer for my benefit? To cause, or sometimes even to allow, someone to suffer for his own good or for the good of someone else, one has to stand in some kind of parental relation towards him. I do not have the right to let some stranger, Joe Bloggs, suffer for his own good or that of Bill Snoggs, but I do have some rights of this kind in respect of my own children. I may let my son suffer somewhat for his own good or for the good of his elder brother, as when I entrust the younger to the temporary care of the elder, with the risk that the elder may hurt his younger brother. Or I may send my daughter to a neighborhood school which she may not much enjoy, but which will benefit her attendance at which will benefit others of the neighborhood. I have such a right in respect of a child of mine, because in small part I am responsible for his or her life and for many of the good things which it involves. It is because a parent is the source of so much good for the child that he or she is entitled to take some of it or its equivalent back if necessary, for example in the form of the life having bad aspects. If the child could understand, he would understand that the parent gives life, nourishment and education, subject to possible retraction of some of the gift. If that is correct, then a God whom is so much more the source of our being than are our parents has so many more rights in this respect. For we depend on God totally from moment to moment, and the ability of parents and others to benefit us depends on God. But it must remain the case that God's rights are limited by the condition that he must not over time take back more than he gives. He must be, on balance, a benefactor. If he creates moral agents, he must give them, on balance, a life worth living. But there do, of course, often look to be lives in which the bad outweighs the good. We can all think of some cases. I think, however, that this is a wrong assessment of many lives for which we are at first inclined to make that judgment. It's a wrong assessment of many such lives because it does not take into account a good which I have so far not mentioned, the good of being of use to others, or rather all the aspects of which I have not so far mentioned. It is an enormous good for anyone to be of use, whether by what they do by free choice, or by what they do involuntarily, or by what happens to them, including what they suffer. Helping someone freely is clearly a great good for the helper. We often help prisoners not by giving them more comfortable quarters, but by letting them help the handicapped. And we pity rather than envy the poor little rich girl who has everything and does nothing for anyone else. And one phenomenon prevalent at any rate in contemporary Western Europe, I don't know how far that's true of Canada, but it's true of a lot of developed countries in recent years, draws our attention especially to this good, the great good of being of use. And that is the evil of unemployment. Because our systems of social security, the unemployed on the whole have enough money to live without too much discomfort. Certainly they are a lot better off than are many employed in Africa or Asia. What is evil about unemployment is not so much any resulting poverty, but the uselessness of the unemployed. They often report feeling unvalued by society, of no use on the scrap heap. They rightly think that it would be a good for them to contribute, but they can't. And it's not only intentional actions freely chosen, but also ones performed involuntarily, which have good consequences for others, which constitute a good for those who do them. If the unemployed were compelled to work for some useful purpose, they would surely be right to regard that as a good thing for them in comparison with being useless. And it is not only intentional actions, but experiences undergone involuntarily or involuntary curtailment of good experiences, as by death, which have good consequences, which constitute a good for those who have them, even if a lesser good than that resulting from a free intentional action. Consider the conscript killed in a just and ultimately successful war in defense of his country against a tyrannous aggressor. Almost all peoples, apart from those of the contemporary developed world of our generation, have recognized that dying for one's country is a great good for the one who dies, even if he was conscripted. Consider, too, someone hurt or killed in an accident, where the accident leads to some reform which prevents the occurrence of similar accidents in the future. For example, someone killed in a rail crash, which leads to the installation of a new system of railway signalling, which prevents similar accidents in the future. The victim, if still alive, and his relatives often comment in such a situation that at any rate he did not suffer or die in vain, although they normally regard the suffering or death as on balance an evil. They would have regarded it as a much greater misfortune for the victim, but apart from the consequences for others, a much greater misfortune for the victim if his suffering or death served no useful purpose. It is a good for us if our experiences are not wasted, but are used for the good of others, if they are a means of a benefit which would not have come to the others without them. Someone may object that the good for the victim, in this situation the victim who suffers a serious accident, is not dying or being disabled. Someone may object that the good for the victim is not dying in a railway crash when that leads to improved safety matters, but dying in a railway crash when the victim knows that improved safety measures will result. And more generally, the objection is that the good in these cases is the experience, the feel-good factor of being of use, not just being of use. But that cannot be right. For what one is glad about when one knows that one's suffering or whatever has had a good effect is not that one learns it, but that it has had a good effect. If one did not think, for example, whether one knows about it or not, it would be good that the suffering should have some effect, one would not be glad about it when one learns that it did. To take an analogy, it's only because I think that it's a good thing that you should pass your exams even if I don't know about it, that I'm glad when I come to know about it. And so generally, the good is the good of being of use whether or not you know about it. It is, of course, a further good that one has a true belief that one's suffering has had a good effect, but that can only be because it's good in itself that it has had that effect. Good for the sufferer, although he may not realize it. And if one thing is good when one learns about it, is that not merely have others benefited in some way, but that by one's own suffering one has been of use in causing that benefit, then that is a good, even if one does not know about it. It follows from being of use, by what one does intentionally, by what does if compelled, by the experiences, painful experiences one has. It follows from being of use, being great good, that whenever God allows some evil to occur to B, for example, causes B to suffer, in order to provide some good for A, for example, the free choice of how to react to this suffering, that B is benefited as well. His life is not wasted. He is of use, either by enduring such evil or by his availability to do so. If B's availability to suffer gives A a certain choice, then B is useful to A. But he's also of use to God. He plays a role in God's plan for A. And to be of use to the good source of being in the redemption of his creation is an enormous good. To use a favorite medieval example, the starving are of use to the wealthy on whose doorstep they appear, because, but for the starving, the wealthy would have no opportunity to being of use. The starving are the vehicle whereby alone the wealthy can be saved from self-indulgence and learn generosity, and thereby the starving are of use to God himself. When one takes into account that those whose evil state is the means of great good to others, and of course often to themselves, when one bears in mind that when one takes into account that those whose evil state is the means of some great good to others, and often to themselves, receives that in... Sorry, the sentence is wrong a bit. When one learns that fact, then it becomes plausible to suppose that God has the right to cause the evil. Remember, this discussion 5 minutes ago began from, does God have the right to make A suffer for the benefit of B? And I am pointing out that when A does suffer for the benefit of B, A is himself also benefited. He's very lucky to be of use, not to be wasted. Of use to B, but also of use to God. And in that case, it becomes plausible to suppose that God has the right to cause the evil. For however you weigh the one against the other, the evil carries with it the great good of being of use, which contributes towards making the lives of the victims on balance good lives, and so ones in which God has the right to include some evil. But I must add, if any life on earth is still, even when we take this into account, is still on balance bad, then God will have an obligation to compensate for that bad in the afterlife, so that the total life of an individual will be on balance good. That in his omnipotence he can do. That is, the obligation on a creator, and to a small extent parents are creators, is to provide a life which is on balance good. But it doesn't follow from that the good things have to occur first and then the bad things. It could be the other way around. But that is the obligation. And if there are people whose earthly life is such that on balance, even when we take into account the good of being of use, if there are people whose earthly life on balance is not a good one, then God has the obligation to compensate with a good afterlife, and that, of course, he can do. And it is the normal Christian teaching of most theistic religions that, in fact, he does do that. Now, I come on finally to the fourth condition, the comparative condition. The good has to be good enough to justify the bad. And when I come to this, someone may agree with me so far that one does need a substantial amount of various kinds of evil in order to provide the opportunity for various goods. Many atheists accept in principle the structure of the argument. But the objector may feel there is just too much evil in the world for the good it produces. There is just not enough good made possible by Hiroshima, the Holocaust, the Lisbon earthquake, the Black Death, the slave trade, and so on. And that is the heart of the objection. It's a quantity objection. With this objection, that if there is a God, he's overdone it, I feel considerable initial sympathy. And when I now proceed to justify God allowing these things, I do hope that you will not think me callous. These are horrible things, and when they happen to people, we must weep. But in cooler moments, we must analyze the logical issues in as rigorous and dispassionate a way as we can, and take very seriously the goods which the evils make possible. And I hope that this is one of these cooler moments. And the first thing to note when we reflect dispassionately is that each evil state or possible evil state eliminated, if you say, well, God could eliminate this particular state, and the argument would still work. Each evil state or possible evil state eliminate at least one actual good. And each small addition to the number of sufferers makes a small addition to the number of those who make serious good choices. And forgive the next example, just take it as it stands and forget the extent of the natural emotions that well up, and understandably well up. Suppose that one less person had been burnt by the Hiroshima atomic bomb. Then there would be one less person able to show courage, and several less relatives of those burnt with stronger reasons than the rest of us to show sympathy for those burnt and to campaign to avoid a similar disaster in future. And that means a few less very serious choices for several people. Of course, removal of just one evil state, or the possibility of one evil state, will not remove very much good, any more than the removal of one grain of sand will make much difference to the fact that you have a heap of sand. But the removal of one grain of sand will make a bit of difference, and so will the removal of one evil state. And each diminution in the seriousness of the evil causes diminution in the seriousness of the moral choices open to us. Sometimes the problem with great evils is not the number of sufferers, but the degree of the suffering. If there is a God, is not the suffering which he imposes or allows others to impose sometimes too intense for the good which it makes possible? But then the evils wouldn't matter so much if only the lesser evils occurred, and so it wouldn't matter so much if we ignored them. By allowing the more serious evils to occur, God forces on people who would otherwise allow themselves to live very easy lives, and so become insensitive to the more ordinary moral demands. He imposes even on these moral slaggards the hard choices, which alone, given their moral torpor, will allow them to begin to become holy people. So many ordinary evils which rather selfish people ignore, selfish people sometimes are forced by seeing the really big horrors to change their attitude. And God is giving them a choice. He's concerned with them as much as with the sufferer. And what the objector is asking for when he says there's too many evils or too intense evils is, yes, there should be diseases, but not ones which maim or kill. Yes, there should be accidents which incapacitate people for a year or two, but not for life. Yes, we should be able to cause each other pain or not help each other to acquire knowledge, but we shouldn't be allowed to damage our own or each other's characters. And our influence should be limited to those with whom we come into contact. There should be no possibility of influencing distant generations for good or evil. This is how the objector goes on. And most of our beliefs about how to cause effects, good or evil, should be beliefs with which we would be born. But now reflect. Such a world would be a toy world, a world where things matter, but they don't matter very much, where we can choose and our choices can make a small difference, but the real choices remain God's. The objector is asking that God should not be willing to be generous and trust us with his world. that he should not give us occasional opportunities to show ourselves at our heroic best. But surely, says the objector, there must be some limit to the suffering which a God would be justified in causing for the sake of the good which it makes possible. And yes, of course there should be some limit, and of course there is such a limit. And there is a limit on the amount of suffering which any human can suffer, except as a result of his own choice. There is a limit of time. I was going to say these days it used to be 80 years, but perhaps it's 90 years now. It's roughly the 90 years of a human life. And there is also clearly a limit of intensity. What the objector must be claiming is that the actual limit is too wide. If there's a God, he asks too much of us. But the objector must take into account the great benefits for the sufferer, which I discussed earlier, of having a free choice of how to cope with his suffering and form a holy character, and the great benefits of being privileged by his suffering to give others the opportunity to help him. When these things are taken into account, there begins, I believe, to be considerable plausibility in the claim that the expected benefit of God allowing that quantity and degree of suffering to occur which actually occurs outweighs the evil of the suffering. Consider this small thought experiment. Suppose you exist in another world before your birth in this world, and you're given a choice as to the sort of life you are to live in this one. You are told that you are only to have a short life, maybe of a few days, although it will be an adult life in the sense that you will have the richness of sensation and belief characteristic of adults. You have a choice as to the sort of life you will have. You can have either a few days of very considerable pleasure, of the kind produced, I am told, by some drug such as heroin, which you will experience by yourself and which will have no effects at all on the world. No one else will know about it. That's one possibility. The other possibility is that you will have a few days of considerable pain, such as the pain of childbirth, which will have, unknown to you at the time of the pain, considerable good effects over several years on others yet to be born. You are told that if you do not make this second choice, those others will never exist. And so you're not under a moral obligation to make the second choice. Moral obligations can only be to existing persons, and those persons wouldn't exist unless you chose the second choice. But you are asked to make the choice which will be the best for you, which will make your own life the best for you to have led. And which will you choose? The heroin life, which is great pleasure, nobody know about it, no effects on anybody, very enjoyable. Or a life which will have considerable pain, but will, unknown to you, produce great effects for good in the years to come. Which will be the best choice for you to lead? And the choice is, I hope, obvious. You should choose the second alternative. That will make it a worthwhile life. The other won't be a worthwhile life. The great value for us of being of use by our actions or suffering to others is, I believe, something very near the surface of the New Testament. I'm not producing this as evidence for the truth of what I'm saying. I'm just saying that, in fact, my arguments suggest that the New Testament, as one might expect, have got it right. An obvious text is the words of Christ as cited by St. Paul in his farewell sermon to the church at Ephesus, when Paul urged the church at Ephesus, quote, to remember the words of the Lord Jesus, how he himself said, it is more blessed to give than to receive. Or again, recall these words of Jesus, you know that those who are accounted to rule over the Gentiles lord it over them, and their good ones exercise authority over them. But it is not so among you, But whoever will be the first among you shall be the servant of all. For verily the Son of Man came not to be ministered unto, but to minister, and to give his life a ransom for many. Greatness, Jesus seems to be saying, consists in service, and it's not a reward for service. Consists in service, consists in being of use, and isn't, its nature is not to be a reward for service. Of course, God would be mad to allow endless suffering to give us endless opportunities for painful service, but God does not do that, and I see no reason to, not to our knowledge, and I see no reason to believe that he would do so, except as a result of our own choice. He makes us suffer at most for the short period of our earthly life, in order that in that life we may help others and form ourselves, and we would be the poorer without those opportunities. Thank you.
I see you on Closer to Truth with Robert Lawrence Kuhn. Closer to Truth. I watch you on it with Robert Lawrence Kuhn. You mentioned in this one the same point. A quick question. You're talking about if it appears the bad outweighs the good, there's a compensatory thing in the afterlife. I understand that for believers, but from a traditional view, and I assume the Orthodox view, if there's a hell and a heaven, then the suffering is just multiplied. There isn't any compensation for the unbeliever. So the greater good thing, I think, is part of it, but not the total.
The church's teaching. But the greatest theologians of the past always said that theoretical belief that there is a God is not necessary. A theoretical belief on earth that there is a God and that a certain religion is true is not necessary for salvation. What is necessary is that if presented with such a belief and given good reasons to believe it, you should believe it. Even Augustine said that. He said, for example, we can know that pagans, non-Jewish people, are acceptable to God because Job is pictured as such a person. And if you take many of the great fathers of the church, they said unbelievers can be saved so long as they are not resistant to belief. And it was a declaration of the Second Vatican Council that atheists could be saved so long as they were not resistant to the church's teaching. So I don't like that interpretation that you have to be a believer at death. What you have to is not resist good reasons for belief, and that's quite different. Now, what I was suggesting by way of compensation, you're quite right, is not, as it were, central to the Christian tradition. What is the way the tradition presents itself is that there's a good state for those who do good, be they atheists or theists, and there's a bad state for those who do bad. But there are plenty of it isn't a central doctrine, but there's plenty of mention of this sort of thing, which I'm mentioning in Scripture and in some of the later church tradition. For example, you may know the parable told by Jesus of the poor man Lazarus who lay at the door of the rich man, and the rich man gave him nothing. And in the afterlife, Lazarus is compensated. Now, there's no suggestion that Lazarus was a good man in any respect. He's just giving compensation for the bad life. And in the medieval Western tradition, you get this idea of limbo. Limbo is a sort of intermediate state between heaven and hell. It's quite a comfortable state, but it's not a state, it's not a reward, it's not a state of reward for the believers. It's rather a place for those who haven't done wrong, as it were, and are being it doesn't actually say compensated, but it clearly can serve the role of a compensation. So there's a certain amount of that there. And as I say, I don't think that there are, myself, given my weighting of things, that there are many lives which are on balance bad, but I may just not be sensitive enough to realize just how much there is. But if that is the case, then quite clearly God in his omnipotence can do this, and I suggest in his perfect goodness he would do this.
Thank you for your talk. Hello again. My objection that I would like to raise has to do with premise 4, which I think is where the real meat of the argument is, right? That the good has to outweigh the evil, right?
Yes, technically the expected value of the good has
right, yeah, the expected, yeah, right. But so you mentioned a quantity objection. I would like to raise a quality objection because I don't think that it's possible for the goods that you've mentioned to actually be able to outweigh the evils in question. And to make the point, I could talk about Doctors Without Borders, right? The Doctors Without Borders. So Doctors Without Borders is a charity organization that in time, right? They display all of the criteria that you have, right? They freely choose to help. They use reason to help. They make themselves better people by choosing to help. They're useful to others, et cetera, right? But if you were to ask any of them whether or not, when pressed, they would obviously say, so Doctors Without Borders that went to go help the earthquake victims in Haiti, they would all obviously say, oh, of course, thank you for your compliment of saying that I was courageous, but of course I would much rather my services had not been needed, right? That it would be much better had I not been needed and had the earthquake not happened at all. That would be the better state, right? And if I were to, so which clearly indicates that they don't think that the good that they're displaying outweighs the evil that the earthquake caused, right? And then if I were to go on to add and say, well, guess what? I have a little secret. 10 years ago, I invented a machine that can stop all earthquakes, but I didn't do it to give you the opportunity to respond to things like the Haiti earthquake so that you could show compassion and courage and make their lives useful. Not only would they say, I don't think that was a good idea, they would think that I was a moral monster for doing that, right? And so intuitively, I don't think and I even have, I think, some evidence that you agree with that intuition. Because when a distraction happens during your talk, you don't think that that provides you and us with an opportunity to exercise moral fortitude, to keep paying attention, right? You want to shut it down immediately, right? And it's better if it didn't happen at all.
I get the point, but you must remember my third criterion. We don't have the right to put other people through it. And if I'd I wouldn't have the right to not to give people the earthquake preventing machine. Only a creator has that right. Only the giver of life has the right to impose so much on his creatures. I have a limited right to put my children through it, not to that extent, but I certainly have a limited right for their good to send them to certain difficult environments and let them work their salvation out that way. I do have that right, but it's a pretty limited right. And in the situation which you describe, nobody has the right to allow earthquakes to continue. We don't have that sort of responsibility for each other. We are not the source of each other's lives in that way that we have the right to take that away. Only God does. Now, you talked a lot, and there was a first point which I have now forgotten, but that's my answer to the second point. What is the first point?
Well, the first point was about, it's all related, right? So the first point is about the fact that we would not ever consider, and this is really about the fourth point, not the third point, right? Yeah. That it's about whether we would actually consider the kinds of goods you're listing as something that would actually outweigh the evil.
Yes, this is that the doctors would say, I wish we didn't have to do this. Well, of course, good doctors are modest people, and they are rightly interested in doing good rather than making themselves good people. Making themselves good people is a byproduct of the good they do. And if people concentrate too much on making themselves saints, they are getting selfish. But nevertheless, it is a good that they are saints, and it does serve that good. And we from outside can see that. They are good enough not to see that, not to concentrate on their own goodness. But we can see that they're good, and we can see that it's a benefit for them. That would be my answer.
Thank you very much.
I have a meta-ethical question about sort of the nature of value and good that you're employing in your argument. So you speak in terms of developing heroic character, talking about rational activity, other sorts of virtues, and so I'm quite sympathetic to virtue ethics, and I agree with the view that suffering disposes toward the development of both moral and intellectual virtues. But my question is, do you have to have that notion of value in order for your argument to work? So if I had a different notion of value, say as utility or some kind of subjective preference or something like that, does the argument require the specifically kind of character, eudaimonistic virtue ethics-based understanding of value?
Well, yes, I mean, that is right. Clearly there are some moral theories around that don't value character or don't value moral action, actually, very highly. The only good is, in a crude utilitarianism, the only good is degrees of pleasure, and this simply won't work for that. I mean, if the only good things were nice sensations, then of course God could give us nice sensations without providing suffering. Yes, it does imply what I would call a rather deeper account of morality, valuing pleasure. Of course pleasure is a good thing, but valuing generosity, giving, helping others, forming people, forming ourselves, making difficult choices, being useful. These are all great goods for us, whereas for a typical utilitarian morality, they're not. They are just unfortunate things that have to happen in order to provide the great good of pleasure. That is a mistaken idea. How can we know that? Well, by simply reflecting on what's involved here and considering the alternatives.
Thank you for your lecture today. I actually have two-part question.
Well, let's start with one and stop at the end of part one, then I'll answer it.
Okay. So in an Orthodox Christian view, evil would be considered contingent in that it was only through man's choice that evil came about and was inherent in the world, whereas good would be a necessary qualification for the world, as that was how God created it. But in a when you're arguing from the evidence as we see it now towards an atheistic standpoint, we can't necessarily appeal to biblical standards. So I was wondering how you would wouldn't good be considered contingent if all we had to go by is libertarian free will and if it's a choice between good and evil? So would good be considered contingent, and that would evil be contingent and not considered necessary.
Not quite certain what you mean by good being contingent, but we'll come to that in a moment. The word evil, unfortunately, is somewhat ambiguous. I was just using it, and I think I said this, but I reinforce this. An evil is simply a bad state of affairs. That includes, of course, suffering, but it also includes wrongdoing. But sometimes when we use the word evil, we think of it as an attribute of people, or at any rate of the bad acts that they intentionally do, and we wouldn't think of someone suffering a pain from a disease as an evil. Now, I'm using evil in a much more general sense. And so when you come to the Christian tradition that evil came into the world as a result of human choice, I think it is being used in the rather stronger sense of people bringing about, intentionally bringing about or allowing to occur big bad states. That is surely true, because there weren't any intent, forget the fall of the angels for the moment, there weren't any intentional bad acts until somebody committed an intentional bad act, and that no doubt led to other people doing the same. So call the first human who had enough moral beliefs to act against them Adam. Adam must have been the first sinner and brought the evil into the world. But that's not to say that there wasn't suffering before then of not a kind brought about by intentional agents other than God, and I certainly think there was. And if you think the Christian tradition denies that, well, in balance, you might be right. But I certainly think that there clearly was suffering before then. There was animal suffering, and there was suffering by humans who, just about humans, didn't have any moral beliefs or anything like that. That was there. And my argument is it serves a good purpose that it was there. But you're right that the really big unpleasantnesses are due to humans, and all the great evils that I have mentioned, with one exception, were brought about by humans. They are cases of moral evil, the exception being the Black Death, of course.
And the second part of the question is, if only, let's say, great goods can be brought about by overcoming evil, would that not make great actions necessary to entail evil in them? And then if God, as the greatest possible good, the summum bonum, would not he then necessarily entail evil?
I didn't say that. I don't think I said something as bold as you attributed to me at first. What I said is certain kinds of good action are only possible in the face of certain kinds of evil. And it's good for us that we can do these kinds of action. God, in his omnipotence, cannot do these kinds of action. But on the Christian doctrine, God is able to take upon himself a human nature in which these are possibilities for him. And therefore, God in Christ, God incarnate, was able to suffer and was able to resist suffering. So God put himself in a position, when was it? Well, half of him, or he acted when incarnate on having two natures. He did his human actions in the light of his human beliefs and human desires, while he did his divine actions in the light of his divine beliefs and divine desires. And in that situation, he did indeed suffer. That is, of course, a complicated doctrine to expound clearly in a couple of minutes, But I say there are resources in the Christian tradition to meet this objection that if God can't, the sort of God I've postulated was not able to do the greatest of good actions. If the Christian doctrine of the Incarnation is right, in that case he was able to do those.
But I was just wondering if it was possible without relying on theology, because if one is arguing with an atheist, they will outright reject the Bible and won't admit it as evidence. So can you do it?
Oh yes, sorry, I wasn't of course depending on the truth of God having become incarnate in Christ. I was just saying that if the doctrine of the Incarnation is a coherent doctrine, whether true or not, then it lies within the possibility of God to put himself in this position. Of course, if it's not a coherent doctrine, then your objection would stand.